Welcome to the Huxley Speaker Series. Today, our guest is Shannon Crossen. She's a senior conservation biologist at ICF. She has over 10 years of experience working with natural resource planning and assessments, both public and private sectors. ICF is a global consulting company with over 50 offices in the United States and Canada, thousands of employees, including an office right here in Bellingham, Washington. Who knew? ICF does work in policy and energy and environment, transportation, health, economic development, a bunch of good stuff. Shannon has a background in natural resource planning and project management, both in the coastal and the inland settings, including ecosystem restoration planning, implementation, monitoring, regulatory planning, conservation plans, policy development, etc. Good stuff. Shannon is formally trained in multidisciplinary collaborations, which comes in handy working with the fellow scientists, governments, stakeholders, public, and as you might imagine. She's been working on habitat connectivity and was going to talk to us today about connectivity and tools that have been developing to better enable conservation efforts. So with that, please let us welcome Shannon Crossen.
I'm here. Hi, thank you.
Great, thanks, welcome.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Okay, well, hello everyone. As he said, I'm a conservation biologist with ICF. I'm stationed here in Bellingham, but I work across primarily the West Coast, and I have some nationwide work as well. And really summarizing all of that stuff that I do, I guess I would say that, you know, the work that we're involved in is really revolving around working with interdisciplinary teams to develop and implement pragmatic approaches to mitigating anthropogenic ecological perturbations. So that's kind of the sciencey way of saying that we are, you know, working on improving the world and the natural system for wildlife and ecosystems, and we do, you know, a lot of really neat conservation work. But today I'm here to talk to you about something really near and dear to my heart, which is the topic of connectivity and ecological connectivity. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to take you on a little journey. And hopefully you guys can see that. Can you see my screen okay, Stefan? Hoping. All right, I think that's
looks
good.
Great.
Great, thank you. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about integrating wildlife ecosystem connectivity into planning. And so there's a lot packed in there, but I'm going to unpack it all for you. And I'm going to give you a little overview of our slides here. So I'm going to start off by explaining what is ecological connectivity, why is it important, why do we care? What are some of the methods that we practitioners are using to enhance and mitigate ecological connectivity? And I'm going to talk a bit about some opportunities for improving coordination and planning, and incorporating ecosystem connectivity into that. And then I'm going to take you on a little demonstration of a proof of concept that we've developed at ICF, and that I've spearheaded, that I'm hoping can help all of us do a better job at implementing and improving connectivity as a whole. And then we're going to do a Q&A. So we'll just dive right in. So what is ecological connectivity? A lot of people have heard of wildlife connectivity. Maybe there's been some notion of an understanding of landscape connectivity. But ecological connectivity is this broader category of connectivity, which according to the IUCN and other groups, is defined as the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. And I think this figure does a really great job of really describing what that looks like. And really what it means is that the connectivity within and between different ecosystems really sustains all life on Earth. And I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about how and why that is, and hopefully I can convince you that this is a really important concept. So why is ecological connectivity important? All species, and this includes plant and animal species, including us humans, we all need access to habitat on a landscape scale to and to move unimpeded through that habitat and that landscape, to access habitat resources such as food, water, and shelter, mates and breeding, and this is all important for genetic interchange, and that includes pollination and seed and gamete dispersal. So I mentioned that because plants often get kind of left out of the conversation and left out of the thought process when it comes to connectivity, but connectivity is really important for plants as well. And then you can also think about regular or seasonal migrations and movement, and that includes both, again, species and ecosystem processes. And something that we're realizing is really, really important is the ability for species to adapt to and escape perturbations. And that includes climate change, wildfires, habitat destruction, and modification, which we all know too well. Another thing that I think is important to keep in mind when thinking about ecosystem connectivity is the idea of nutrient cycling and other ecosystem processes. I'm sure a lot of people in the Pacific Northwest, especially environmental and ecology students, are aware of marine-derived nutrients that come from our salmon species and come up into the upland terrestrial ecosystems. So that's a really great, I think, example of that I think a lot of people would be familiar with. So ultimately, you know, the survival and the health of our ecosystems, our species, really depends on this connectivity. And it's really critical to the existence and the conservation of really everything that's part of the natural world. And, you know, that's all great, but we have some challenges. Unfortunately, we've learned a lot about the importance of ecosystem connectivity and really the ecological science a little too late and long after we've developed really vast amounts of our planet, and we've built roads and developed massive cities, and we didn't know about the importance of these things. So unfortunately, that's resulted in massive habitat fragmentation globally. And habitat fragmentation is just what it sounds like it is. It's the fragmentation of larger blocks of habitat into smaller fragmented pieces that are fragmented by roads or other types of human developments. And that connectivity of those species and that ecosystem connectivity that we just talked about can't occur across that landscape anymore the way it once did. And this can be really critical for many species and ecological processes. For instance, something that we all know really well and are familiar with is roadkill. So from wildlife vehicle collisions, and that's when species are trying to cross a road and get struck by a vehicle. Often they're trying to cross to disperse into new habitat or access food and water or other resources that are separated on both sides of the road. So that can be really problematic. And ultimately, you know, this results in fragmentation, but also habitat loss, edge effects, and disturbance. The habitat along the edges of these developments, you can see the lighter green up here in the habitat fragmentation figure. You know, all of the habitat that's exposed to those edges tends to be a lot more disturbed. You have less biodiversity, and the health of the animals is actually much less than it is for animals on the interior of those habitat patches. So really important conservation implications there. In addition to all of that, you can have altered wildlife behavior, animals that might avoid certain areas or not even want to cross a road. And then you have a full, you know, barrier, and you have limited or complete loss of genetic interchange between or within populations of a particular species. And I think, you know, another aspect of this that's really important and is often underlooked and overlooked and under discussed really is human safety as it relates to wildlife vehicle collisions. So I've got a figure here of a pretty graphic figure of a deer coming through the front of a car. And this is really common in the United States. We have a very high number of deer vehicle collisions, and vehicle collisions with large animals in North America. And it's a very important factor that needs to be considered as well. Another thing I'll point out is in the first figure here in the bottom, it shows a culvert which it's perched above the water level. And so for aquatic species like our salmon and other species that are aquatic and can't go above that culvert and connect to habitat another way, that's a complete barrier. So lots of opportunities, unfortunately, for our infrastructure and developments to impact wildlife and cause fragmentation and other type of barriers to ecological connectivity. Another note on the wildlife vehicle collisions, we have at least $1 billion US dollars per year in vehicle associated costs from these vehicle collisions in the United States. 29,000 human injuries and 211 human fatalities nationwide. That's estimated annually, and I think those figures come back from 2008. So they are dated, and it could be more now. Those numbers have declined a bit with COVID because there's less people moving and driving around and moving about. But we don't know what the future holds, and it's likely that as transportation and our regular schedules go back at least to somewhat of a new normal, that we're going to continue to see these numbers, which is really unfortunate. 5% of all reported motor vehicle collisions and accidents are caused by wildlife vehicle collisions. The vast majority of those are with deer. They estimate that about 40% are underreported, and so I think that I'm painting a picture here that it's a really important issue that we need to work on improving. And just to give you one more visual and to really underscore that and drive the point home, here is a map of roads in the United States, and we have 4 million miles of roads in the United States alone. That's a lot of miles of roadway, and 3.2 trillion miles driven in 2016. So again, that's probably decreased pretty dramatically with COVID, but that's a pretty high and startling number. And you can start to see just from the road infrastructure alone, the degree of habitat fragmentation that is occurring in the country, the amount of wildlife vehicle collisions that are occurring, and the gravity of the situation. All right, so that's kind of the sad stuff and the not so exciting part of this talk. So let's talk about methods that we can implement to improve connectivity. So I know most of you, if not all of you, have seen wildlife crossings. We have the figure on the bottom is our own I-90 wildlife overpass in Washington. That was actually the second wildlife overpass that was built in the state of Washington. The first one is in Redmond, and it gets not as much publicity because it's not as large and not as iconic, but it's a very successful wildlife overpass developed by King County. And this one has been built and it's being utilized, and I think they had their first cougar cross over it recently. Don't quote me on that. WashDOT has all the details, but it's been very successful. And then I have some other photographs from some wildlife crossings that I've visited in Wyoming, California, and then a fish passage in Skagit County. And so this can give you a little bit of an idea of when we want to build infrastructure, particularly above or below roadways, how we can facilitate connectivity. But there's a few things I want to point out. Number one, first of all, you probably don't see these all over the place, particularly the overpasses, because they're not very common here in the United States. They're actually much more common in Europe and some other places in the world. So we are slowly catching up. But the purpose of these really is to avoid and minimize impacts on wildlife connectivity, right? Not just that connectivity, but also reducing those vehicle collisions and improving road safety. So they have a lot of benefits. The other thing that I think is important to point out, and in particular for the fish passage, which is the figure all the way to the upper right, this is a fish passage project that was done, it looks like it was done in 2012 in Skagit County. And this was probably a small pipe, if not a perched culvert like I showed you in the figure before, where fish and aquatic species just could not pass it. It was a complete barrier. And so we're doing a lot of work throughout the world improving these fish passages, typically in the form of culverts like this one. So I think that's important to keep in mind when people think about wildlife crossings. They don't often think about fish passages, but I want to plant the seed and have you think of them all together. And I think it's going to be clear why in a moment. So in Western Washington alone, we have around 1,200 fish passage barriers that are slated to be replaced. So all of our Pacific salmon species are threatened and or endangered, and we also have we have other anadromous fish in the region which are imperiled, and many other aquatic species which are imperiled as well. So it's extremely important, primarily for the salmonids, to repair these barriers. But many of these fish passage barriers really warrant broader design considerations for other species of wildlife, not just fish. And often, when these fish passage barriers are identified and planned and remediated, and larger culverts are put in for the fish to successfully pass through, considerations for wildlife are often not on the agenda. They often don't cross the minds of the folks working on these projects, and that includes biologists, engineers, and planners. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So first, the figure to the upper figure of the map of Washington. This shows you a map of all of the fish barriers in the state of Washington. The green ones have been remediated. So the culverts have been upsized and they've been engineered and constructed in a way that does not impede fish movement. The red ones, I believe, are full barriers, and the yellow are, don't quote me on this, but I think the yellow are either unidentified, the status of them, or in the progress of being remediated. So this is from the WashDOT Washington State Fish Passage database. So anybody can look this up online and you can explore the data. But ultimately what happens is these culverts are replaced, and often they're replaced with a larger culvert like the one I showed you earlier from Skagit County, or something like the one in the lower left here on the slide. And this is a wonderful looking fish passage. Fish are going to be very happy to move up and down the stream. And I would imagine other aquatic species and semi-aquatic species and small animals would be able to utilize this as well. But anything that's large, either too large to fit through this culvert or is unwilling to move through the culvert because it has some sort of behavioral reason why it doesn't want to enter into it and pass through, those species are going to pop up over the road to move through this landscape and move over the road. And they're going to be subject to wildlife vehicle collisions. Occasionally, we have what I call accidental wildlife crossings, and that's the figure on the lower right. This is a fish passage culvert that was remediated, and just because of the topographical constraints, the elevation of the road, and other engineering details, I believe there was no other reason, potentially maybe the bankful width of the stream and other hydrological constraints. This was implemented and made into a larger box culvert, kind of a small bridge really. And the deer are using it, and they've had good wildlife use at this location. This is again another WSDOT example, so if you want details, you can contact them. But I thought this was a really great example of, again, what I call accidental wildlife crossings. And what I would love to see many fish passages look like in areas that might warrant them. But how do we know which fish passages might warrant constructing a larger structure, and how might we know when the right location, where the right location is, and when the right time is to invest that additional money into this larger, more expensive infrastructure to facilitate wildlife connectivity and or reduce wildlife vehicle collisions? And really right now, nationwide and worldwide, we don't have tools that allow us to visualize multiple data sets to really get at some of these questions and identify some answers that might help us with better decision making. Another thing that I think is really interesting is that fish and wildlife connectivity are conducted within completely different subdisciplines. So often the folks working on these might even be within different departments or different offices, and they might not really collaborate much at all. I would like to give a shout out to WSDOT, who has, of all the DOTs that I know are working on this, are doing a really tremendous job, and I think are leading the way. I still think we have progress to go on a local level, state level, national level, and a global level, because fish passage and wildlife connectivity are of global concern. But you know, there's a lot of opportunity for us to improve that planning process and making sure that people are collaborating and that we're aware of where issues are early on. So one of the things that I saw that was lacking was a central location where we could visualize diverse data sets, provide on-the-fly analytics, and really start to drill down into how to answer some of these questions and explore the data in a more comprehensive and meaningful way. So I decided, well, why not create some sort of a proof of concept or a case study and start seeing what was possible and playing around with it and getting feedback and starting to build it from the ground up. And that is what we did. So I'm gonna take you on a demonstration of this tool. We're calling it the ICF Connectivity Planning Tool. And let me open this up and share this with you. I'm going to take you on a little journey, and we'll go ahead and I'll give you an overview of the tool, and then we'll dive in and look at some Bellingham specific data, which I think will be neat. I think most of us here are from that region, so this will hit close to home. So I think you all know this landscape pretty well. This is our state. And what we have here are a bunch of base data layers, which we can turn on and off and just start exploring the data. So I'm going to take you through this first. And the first two, well, the first layer I'm turning on are wildlife carcass data collected on our state highway system. And this is WSDOT data. And it is, yes.
We're still seeing your slide, not the tool.
Oh, thank you for telling me.
You may have to share a different screen.
Okay. Oh, I have a feeling I know why. Let's give this another try. Okay, hopefully that worked.
Yep, looks good.
Cool. Okay, so here's Washington. I think most of us know the state pretty well. And so this first layer that I turned on is the, like I was saying, this is the wildlife carcass data. This is the carcass data that WSDOT picks up on a regular basis. And I have to say they do an amazing job at collecting this data. I'm not sure many other state departments of transportation have this great of a data set. So another big shout out to WSDOT. It's comprehensive, it covers the whole state. These data sets are never perfect, but we have data dating back. You can see here the slider, the data slider. It starts in 2017, and it, the data I have goes until 2007 to 2017. I think there's a 2018 updated data set available. And I'll just move the legend over here. So the symbols that you see are indicating the size of the carcass. We have large, medium, small, or unknown. And then what I think is really remarkable is that we don't have, if you look at the symbology here in the legend, we don't have a black, we have red, purple, and gray. And so all of these black that you're seeing, these are areas of overlap. That just means that we have so much carcass data that it's overlapping on top of one another, and we have some pretty high density carcass data. So I think that's pretty interesting. And then I also would like to point out that this is just 2017 alone that we're looking at right now. So I don't have the capability yet to toggle the data set to show groups of years or specific years. For instance, if you wanted to look at like 2010 to 2015, I don't have the capability of doing that yet, but it's within the realm of possibility. So this just gives you an idea of what the data looks like over time. And what we definitely notice is that the state has gotten really good in more recent years at collecting data from some of these smaller species, which is great. Those tend to be pretty hard data to capture, but we're also seeing a higher number of collisions. So that's the carcass data. So that's the roadkill that you all are going to be familiar with. But we also have crash data, which is a little different. Crash data is actually reported through either highway patrol records or other types of formally reported vehicle crashes. And these are crash data that specifically indicated that the crash involved some sort of wildlife. And I should note that if you want, to investigate a specific point, you can click on it. This one tells us that this vehicle struck a deer. No one was injured. It was during the day and during dry conditions. So we can get some pretty good attribute data. And likewise for the carcass data, if you click on a particular point of interest, we have a safety rank that we've allocated. The larger species have a high safety rank. The smaller species have a lower safety rank. It'll tell you the size and the species. So good ability to explore the attributes of these data layers. And if you turn them both on, you can see the crash data and the carcass data together. There will be some inherent redundancies in these data, and some specific analyses will attempt to try to remove those redundancies, but it tends to be really hard to do that. And many of the animals that get hit by cars, they don't die on the highway. And we know that the roadkill and carcass data are already an underrepresentation, so sometimes people will actually merge these data sets and use them as one to attempt to try to get a somewhat accurate number. But all of this together, even with redundancies, is an underestimate of what's going on. And then again, we have our full data sets here. So you can see all the years together, what that looks like. And there's just a lot of black. There's a lot of high density. The data is occurring in high density across all of the highways. So interesting to look at, but also important is our fish passage data. So in Washington, we have some really interesting things going on with our fish data. Some of you may or may not be aware of the Supreme Court case. And so we have areas of prioritization within Western Washington where the fish passage barriers occurring within this green polygon are very high priority to be remediated, and the state is working really, really hard to get a lot of projects through. Again, I think I estimated that it was around 1,200 just in Western Washington alone, and I think that covers the case area. So of those injunction culverts, we have all of these blue dots. So these are uncorrected injunction culverts. This represents quite a lot of fish barriers along our highway system. We also have a lot of corrected sites throughout the state, and those are the green dots. So you can see that we've already done a lot of work here in Washington statewide to remediate these fish passage barriers, but we still have a lot of work to go. And then as part of that injunction, we have a 6-year plan here, and these are the 6-year high priority fish passage barriers that are going to be remediated. So this can give you an idea of kind of what's coming up the pipeline sooner rather than later. And this is important because it gives us some insight for planning purposes where projects are occurring and where we might prioritize investigating whether some of these culverts might warrant additional considerations for other species rather than just fish. So in addition to those data, we also have some statewide wildlife linkage modeling data available here. This is more just for demonstration purposes. There's a lot of different ecological data that we can bring into this space and explore, but this just gives you an idea of the types of information we can bring in: modeling data, land cover data, land use data, land ownership. Lots of different factors are really important for planning on a landscape scale or projects, specific project areas. So also, lots of ability to toggle on and off and really identify what's overlapping and how some of these data sets are interacting. Okay, so I think this is probably the more exciting part, but it's the statistics. So I'm not going to bore you with any math or numbers, but we have a couple of different ways that we can represent hotspot analysis, which is really just a fancy way of doing a density or cluster analysis. But because we're on linear infrastructure, we have some assumptions that are that need to be met, and a specific just a handful of statistical models that we use. And these may or may not be useful depending on the types of questions you're asking, but it's available to visualize. And so these darker red areas are higher density wildlife collision areas, but they're also statistically significant compared to areas on the road that are the cooler yellow colors. So you can get an idea of where those hotspots are occurring. And there's different input parameters really depending on the scale that you want to conduct the hotspot analysis. So we have some different options that you can toggle on or off here. Another thing that is commonly used rather than conducting statistical analysis, something that we're really interested in is just really what are the number of collisions or crashes that are occurring on a specific 1-mile segment of road, or maybe a quarter-mile segment of road. So this is just one way to visualize that data, and you can toggle around and really put in the inputs that really make sense with the questions that you're asking and the landscape that you are working in. But for the most part, we tend to look at things on a milepost or post-mile basis because that's the way our transportation system is organized, and it's usually a pretty good number. And so what we can see here is that the larger the circle, the higher density we have of collisions in these areas. And as we kind of zoom out and look through the state, we can visualize this and see that we have some problem areas, and one of them is in Bellingham. So before we zoom into Bellingham though, I have one more thing I want to show you, which I think is really interesting. And I conducted this analysis just on the fish passage culverts in Western Washington. But what I was curious to know was, of the uncorrected existing fish passage barriers in Western Washington, which of those have the most wildlife vehicle collisions occurring near them, and of those, which ones had compiled the most accumulated cost of wildlife vehicle collisions. And so we conducted that analysis on each culvert and basically ran a 1 mile radius, and all of the crash and carcass data were grabbed in the algorithm, and then we identified the type of animal, the cost of those collisions based on cost benefit analysis data that's available in the literature, and then we looked at the cost from 2011 to 2017, and we came up with some rough estimates of how much cost had been accumulated due to those collisions. So some of these culverts, the larger, darker red locations, are accumulating up to $500,000 in wildlife vehicle collision associated costs. And again, keep in mind that this is an underestimate of what's probably actually occurring. And so some of these culverts are accumulating a lot of cost. And if you extrapolate that out even further to the estimated lifespan of the infrastructure, which is around 75 to 100 years old, maybe 75 if you're being conservative, you can imagine how expensive that can be. And so in some cases, we can really easily see that the cost benefit analysis warrants investing a little bit more money into building a larger culvert or maybe a small bridge to facilitate that wildlife connectivity, employing some wildlife fencing to keep these animals off the road, and to facilitate that connectivity of these species and improved road safety. So that's what I'm really interested in here. And there's a couple of interesting examples in Bellingham. So let's go ahead and zoom in and take a look. And Bellingham is interesting because people always ask, why is there so much roadkill in Bellingham? And we have a lot. So I'm just going to show you the full data sets. And we're lighting up the I-5 like a Christmas tree. And as you get closer to the city center, you actually get pretty high density, which I'm starting to see this pattern occur in other cities across the different states that I work in. And one of the problems that we have in Bellingham, which I think is contributing to this, is that we have a really robust urban deer population, which we love and we love to feed. And so they're basically, pretty happy and cozy living here. We have a very mild climate. They don't need to migrate. They get food all year round from really lovely neighborhood residents that shouldn't be feeding them. But this is a really great example of how wildlife-human interaction can result in really unintended consequences of wildlife conflict. And so that's a really important aspect of planning connectivity projects. It's not all the stuff I already talked about, but it's also, what are the implications of facilitating connectivity? Are there any unintended consequences? Are there areas where it might not make sense to facilitate connectivity, but it might make more sense to put fencing up and prevent animals from getting into a certain location? And I think Bellingham is a great case study of a lot of really complex decisions that will need to be made, because we also have a lot of green space and a lot of really important habitat areas, and we want to make sure wildlife can access those as well. So it's definitely a very complex process. All right, so let's look at a couple of fish passage barriers in Bellingham that I think are particularly interesting. And I'm going to go ahead and look at Patton Creek. near Fairhaven. This is right before the old Fairhaven Parkway exit. There is a fish passage here. It's a pretty long, dark, narrow culvert, but a person could get through if they crunched down, but a deer could not pass through. And for those that know the area, we've got, pretty mixed residential in this on this western side of the freeway with some nice habitat, and then same on the other side. So this is an interesting situation where we have an existing fish passage barrier. We have a lot of roadkill occurring here. For those of you that drive through this area regularly, I'm sure you've unfortunately seen evidence of that. It's really bad. The deer just are not comfortable passing through this small culvert, and so they go over the top of the freeway reluctantly, but they do, and they get hit. And I've seen coyotes and other animals passing over the top of the freeway there as well. So be careful when you're driving, but also an interesting situation because we are near a more developed area, but not, near city center. And so important decision making would need to be made here, and further studies to really identify, does it make sense to build a wildlife crossing here? This is a pretty elevated section of highway, so it would be really expensive to implement one. But we also have a lot of vehicle collisions, and I'm assuming that we probably have some human injuries that have occurred and will continue to occur if that's not addressed. So there might not be a clear answer right away, but what I think this data does is it makes it really clear that we need to further investigate and work with an interdisciplinary team of biologists and engineers and fish experts and wildlife experts, as well as transportation planners, and really look at this holistically and figure out what makes sense. And the data probably, just the ecological and wildlife vehicle collision data alone would probably warrant improving that passageway. So, but I also want to point out another one which I think is a great example, and that's, we're kind of cruising up here through Bellingham, up through city center, and we're over by Bellis Fair Mall. And we have a whole bunch of fish passage barriers right next to the mall. So I'm gonna go ahead and give you a different base map so you can kind of get an idea of what this landscape looks like. So we've got some green space. I think this is a golf course. And we've got, some forested areas, but for the most part, this is pretty highly developed. And just outside of downtown and highly developed Bellingham. So, who would have thought that there were fish passage barriers right there next to the mall that are going to be remediated. So I think these are some really interesting cases. They don't have as much accumulated cost from vehicle collisions, but they have some. Again, we did a 1 mile search radius, so that could be picking up data from other portions of the highway or of I-5 or the or Meridian. So not 100% sure, but those can, those are things that we can look at with these data sets and identify really what's driving these numbers. But I think that, at the end of the day, we're not going to be putting in a wildlife crossing next to a mall in a developed area. So it's really important not to just assume that because you have wildlife vehicle collision data in an area that it makes sense to implement a wildlife crossing or to put forth efforts to facilitate wildlife connectivity, but the fish still need to move, and the fish need, can go further up into the habitat upstream where they are breeding, and that is what we need to focus on in these areas. So just a really important to keep in mind, there's a lot of factors driving how we ultimately make these decisions, but having planning tools like this where we can bring in diverse sets of data, overlap them, explore them, dive in, and do different types of analyses, I think are really the pathway forward towards better planning, long-range planning, project planning, and ultimately better outcomes for wildlife and an ecosystem. So I think I wanted to also point out that in addition to these aspects of the tool that I've shared, there's so much more that can be done with tools like this. I'd like to see more intensive cost-benefit calculations to be conducted in this space so that we can really drill down into making better decisions and having a little bit more confidence in what the different costs would actually be for different outcomes. There's also different ways that we can prioritize, whether it be the wildlife vehicle collision data or the hotspots or fish passages or other data sets. And so all of that can just depend on the questions of the user and really what's driving the analysis. But ultimately, these tools are highly malleable and they're very simple to set up and use. And so I think that that's something that's really going to help us make some great progress.
Okay.
And that's it. Am I on time?
Yeah, it's great.
Good.
So we got a few questions coming in. One of them is basically the question is, what's the learning curve for the animals? So when a barrier goes in, how do they know that's not? It may appear as a barrier to them as well. Even I mean, when a crossing goes in, how does that not?
That's a great question. So there's not, like with all answers to any biological question, it depends, right? It depends on the species, it depends on the individuals. For some ungulates like deer and elk, it can take years for populations to be fully habituated. Other animals move very opportunistically through the landscape, and they don't really have much of an idea of what's going on, you know, beyond maybe their immediate view shed. I'm thinking like a toad or a frog. And so we might have to give them a little bit of extra help with funnel fencing or, you know, big, large, expansive crossing structures to, you know, make sure that they can utilize them. So there are methods that we can implement to decrease the learning curve and increase the usage of it sooner. And it just depends on the species that we're facilitating. But I'd also say that when you're designing structures, there are so many details that go into making sure that the structure is going to facilitate the species that you're intending to use the structure. So there's lots that we can do on that kind of back-end design to make sure that it's as suitable as possible. And then there's other things we can do after they've been implemented. I've even heard of people putting salt licks up for elk and deer to get them comfortable around the crossings, and that has helped. Or installing bat boxes. That's something that I've done and continue to recommend to do, is to install bat boxes so that bats and swifts and crevice dwelling aerial species will feel more comfortable utilizing them.
Great. Another question was, do the higher density collision regions tend to be correlated with more traffic or more animals?
That's a great question. So another one that depends on the specific species. Some species have very predictable patterns of behavior as a function of traffic volume. So as traffic volume is lower, they might use the roadway more. As traffic volume goes really high, they might use the road less. And at those intermediate levels, you might, for some species, have really high levels of collisions because it's just in that sweet spot where they feel comfortable enough to cross and aren't completely deterred. For other species, even very low levels of traffic volume can be a complete barrier. And then there are other species that we call non-responders, which they just don't respond at all to traffic volume, and they'll go right into the road regardless. So we have different behavioral categories that we assign species to, and it just depends on what their behavioral traits are.
Yeah, thanks. And a question about budgets and funding. Do you know, is it more federal or state, and where's that money coming from? And how much is there versus how much would we need if we were going to really address all these issues?
Yeah, so there's lots of different funding sources for fish passage or wildlife connectivity projects and wildlife crossings. That can range from state, local, regional to federal funding, as well as lots of NGO funding. It just depends on the particular project. I have projects that are funded through grants from the federal government or through tribal grants, or some NGOs. National Wildlife Federation is actually building the largest wildlife crossing in the world in Los Angeles right now. It's going to be $80 million, and they are, you know, they're leading the funding for that. So that's an example. So it just depends. There's a lot of funding available. And so it just, but unfortunately, some of these projects are getting really expensive, particularly across large freeways. So, you know, 40 to 80 million dollars to build an expansive overpass over freeways in our really, really highly developed and highly populated areas like Los Angeles. So that is a little bit problematic, but a lot more affordable in some of our, on our smaller freeways.
Yeah, yeah, great. Well, I think we are running out of time. Shannon, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate your joining us. I want to just put in a plug for next week. Dr. Manuel Montano from Huxley College will be talking about nanoparticles, so a really different scale of study and focus. Great, and so we'll see you all next week again. Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you.